Ready to win the battle for your team's attention? Build a digital collection of professional development titles to keep your people learning, growing, and productive with Overdrive. Drive performance, engagement, and culture with Overdrive. Learn more at company.overdrive.com/corporate-libraries.
Welcome to The Accidental Trainer, a podcast where you'll hear firsthand stories and tips on how to start and grow your training career.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of ATD Accidental Trainer Podcast. I'm your host, Alexandria Clapp, and today we have with us Karin Hurt and David Dye. They are the CEO and president of Let's Grow Leaders and authors of the newly released book, Powerful Phrases for Dealing with Workplace Conflict. What to say next to de-stress the workday, build collaboration, and calm difficult customers. Welcome, Karin and David.
Thank you so much for having us.
We are excited to be with you.
I am so excited to talk to you today about navigating workplace conflict with really practical communication techniques. We're going to explore that shortly. But first, I would love to chat a little bit about your origin stories. Can you share how you've landed in your current role working together? What was something accidental in your journey?
Yeah, well, we accidentally fell in love, but let's give you the backstory first there. So I was working at Verizon for 20 years. The first decade was leadership development, organizational development. I led a large training organization. And then I did a variety of field assignments, a 2,200 person sales team, a 10,000 person customer service organization. And in my final role there, I was leading our strategic partnership channel, which was all of the outsourced contact centers that were taking Verizon's calls. And we had led a massive transformation from having a really abysmal experience to a really great customer experience in a variety of ways. And I was doing that and very much focusing these centers on human-centered leadership. And while I was doing that work, I started writing a blog. It was all about what we were doing, practical tools and techniques. That's how it all kind of started, because people started calling and saying, hey, when are you going to write your book? Can you be our keynote speaker? Can you train us on how to do this stuff? And I'm like, no, I have like this big executive job. I can't do that. But then after a while, I thought, well, what if I could, right? What if I could? And so it took a big leap to start Let's Grow Leaders. And I'll let David pick up the story from there.
Yeah. So in my thread, I had a 17-year career in human service work, and I was doing in that capacity with a scaling organization, a lot of leadership development for executive leaders. And it had grown beyond what I could personally do face-to-face the way I most like to do it. So I also started a blog sharing those leadership principles and so forth to get that out to everyone who I couldn't be with all the time. Well, in the course of both of us writing about leadership, we got to know each other online via that writing. And eventually one day, talking about accidental, I saw a human resource magazine, and there was an article in the magazine, and I said to myself, I don't remember submitting this or giving them approval to publish this. Well, that's interesting. And then as I read through it, the final paragraph had a slight different twist. And then it wasn't my article at all. It was Karin's article. The byline was hers. And I'm like, wow, we are so aligned. I could have written this. And so I reached out and said, hey, we are so aligned. We should collaborate on something. Let's write a white paper, an article, a blog post, something. We eventually ran into each other at a conference, a book publishing lab outside of Manhattan, where we were talking to agents and editors and so forth. Realized we were really wanting to write a very similar book. And we had both written a small self-published book earlier in our career. So at that point, we were looking to do something beefier and with a publisher and so forth. And we decided to collaborate. Said, well, let's write this together. Rather than compete, we decided to collaborate. And the product of that was our first co-authored book, Winning Well, A Manager's Guide to Getting Results Without Losing Your Soul. And in the course of writing that book, we got to be really good friends. And as the book was publishing, it had just come out, realized that that friendship had grown to be something more. And so Karin was the one who got there first. I have to give her full credit. She said that, but it was awesome. And so we merged our businesses, got married, and Let's Grow Leaders is now over a decade of working with leaders all over the world, except for Antarctica. So if anybody's at Murdo Station, we would love to work with you if you're listening. But otherwise, tens of thousands of leaders all over the world and their teams. And so it's a very fruitful journey. But the accidental part of that is so fun, right? Those moments of, wow, that happened and then this happened. And it's what we do with those moments that take us to the next level.
Cool that you decided to take that leap that helped create these other happy accidents happening, Karin. I love that story. Thank you guys for sharing. So I feel like we're in such a happy place. And then I'm going to take us to talking about conflict, because you guys have that in your title in your book, and you created an entire survey to evaluate how folks are experiencing it, the causes, the effects. So can you share a little bit of your findings and why that conversation is even relevant right now?
We started this World Workplace Conflict and Collaboration Survey. So we surveyed over 5,000 people in 46 countries to ask a number of questions. One, is conflict actually getting worse over the last couple of years? Because we had a feeling that it was. And if so, what is the nature of the conflict? Like, what's different post-pandemic than before? Then we asked people to think about a workplace conflict that they had in the past, something that was significant. And then what advice would they give their former self if they were faced with that conflict again? And then we did a quantitative analysis and a qualitative analysis to really look for what some of those themes were. And I'll let David share some of the findings.
Yeah, that first question about is conflict, is there more or less of it in the workplace today? And 70% of people, of those 5,000 folks, said that there is same or more conflict today than ever before. And what's interesting is you think about that 30% who said, well, I'm experiencing less. Well, when you dig into that, there's some information there too. Half of those folks say the reason they're experiencing less is basically they've escaped. They left a toxic workplace. They got away from a conflict-prone coworker. They're working from home and they're just not interacting with people anymore, and therefore they're having less conflict. And in all of those situations, that might feel better for that individual, but what is lost in all of that? And it goes to even when you said, hey, we're at a happy place, I hate to take us to conflict. We actually want us to go to conflict because good conflict is collaborative. It's productive. It takes us to a better place. And what we're trying to avoid and work our way through and navigate is to transform destructive conflict. Let's get rid of that. Nobody needs any of that. That's tearing us down, making us feel worse, but to get to that constructive, collaborative way of interaction. So that's what we're actually after. And that half of those folks who are experiencing less, they're not getting that either, which is sad. And then to that bigger question on what's a major workplace conflict you've had and what advice would you give to your former self, just to set the stage for the rest of our conversation. I mean, it was huge. All the folks who said the advice I would give to my former self, 55% of them said, my advice to myself would be to be more patient, stay calm. And then 21% said, talk about it sooner, have the conversation. And so that's amazing. In a sample size that big, 76% of people saying my advice to myself would be calm, stay patient, talk about it. Those are overwhelming numbers from a statistical sampling perspective. And yet, as frequent as that advice might be, it's the how that's so important. And so that's what the rest of the book is all about, is how to help people have those conversations in a productive way.
And Alexandria, it's really interesting from an ATD perspective. So we had a session at the Global Conference 2 weeks ago. There were about 500 people in the room, and we asked people these questions, and it was very, very consistent with the research. So just to point out that this is true for training and learning leaders too, that the advice would be stay calm and talk about it or talk about it sooner.
As well as the percentages experiencing more or less conflict. It was amazing how similar in a room of 500 people that the results were the same.
It's interesting. It definitely made me think just how to reframe how I'm thinking about conflict, because you're talking about a lot of the causes. You look at stress and mental health and the pandemic, how they exacerbated stress and mental health and all sorts of other types of things that I guess I was imagining maybe there's sort of what you were saying, David, less because people are switching to maybe avoidance, or because they're remote and they're interacting with people less and there's less confrontation because maybe less direct communication, maybe that's harder in virtual settings. So yeah, I loved all that research up front that really helps me realize that I'm maybe not even looking at it the right way.
And what's interesting in all of that is when you talk about the causes, the two dominant causes and people could respond with up to 3 choices of all of the different sources. So there's overwhelm, burnout, understaffing. 27% of folks identified that as a major contributing factor. Tied with it was poor management practices, also 27% choosing that. And what's in all of that is when you tease out poor management practices, there's so much going on in the world of work these days that's changing. You've got, the changes that the pandemic caused in hybrid, remote, this constant shift back and forth, employees' demands for health and wellness and a more balanced work life that's sustainable. And yet, how does that translate to the results that the team also needs to produce? Vulnerability, transparency, the emotional support. There are a lot of changes happening, and managers have not been fully equipped to keep up with those. And so some of these demands from the workforce, they're healthy and they're complicated and they're complex. And so we've got some work to do to help managers get there. So it's not just that managers stink, it's that the workplace is also significantly changing.
So you mention in your book that so many organizations reported that just improved communication leads to less conflict, which I love that. That seems very practical, but it also kind of has that powerful phrases could seem too good to be true vibe, or maybe this is just more like business speak that you have to learn and memorize to know the code to navigate the workforce. So why isn't that the case for this book and these phrases?
The thing is, most conflict comes from an expectation violation of some sort, right? Like I expected that you would clean up your coffee mugs before you left the conference room, and you thought the magic coffee fairy was going to clean them up. And now we have a conflict, right? Or I expected that you would have this report to me by 3:00, but I just said to you, I need it soon. And what does soon mean? And so a lot of times what we really need to think about is, how do you create better clarity? How do you use these phrases to make sure that you are really engaging? So we have 4 dimensions of workplace conflict, which is connected. Are we connected as human beings? Clarity. Do we have a shared understanding of success? Curiosity, are we genuinely interested in other people's perspective and what's possible? And commitment, do we have a shared agreement? So powerful phrases can sound like a gimmick, but we're not going to give you a powerful phrase for every single conflict you ever have. And you're not going to be able to script the conflict. But if you can ground yourself and say, what is needed here in this moment? Do we need connection? Do we need clarity? Do I need to be more curious? Do we need to figure out what we both agree on here? And then from there, what are some ways that you can communicate that well? Because a lot of people are lacking the confidence to have these conversations. And so we can say, well, here for this acute conflict emergency that you're in, if you go to the table of contents, what is happening for you in your world right now? And you can go and say, oh, I'm dealing with a passive aggressive coworker. Where do I start? And these powerful phrases give you some options of where do you start in these situations. And then you can do you, right? Then you say, well, how do I make these words my own?
Yeah, and I think that part of the goal here is to open the door to a meaningful conversation. And so that's so many of these powerful phrases. That's what they do. They open the door, they allow you to walk in, they allow you to invite the other person into that meaningful conversation. And it's actually the exact opposite of workplace jargon. Jargon so often obscures meaning, means one thing to one person, not to another. And as you get into all of the phrases, none of them rely on that kind of language. In fact, we specifically intentionally try to avoid it because it doesn't translate from one person to the next.
I love it. You talked about clarity. And when I was reading, I was thinking about just the intentionality. I feel like I use that word all the time, and especially since so many people went remote and hybrid, because there's certain things that we were maybe in air quotes getting away with in person where it just wasn't as explicit and intentional that you absolutely have to do remote or hybrid. that you have to think about. And maybe it wasn't even we were getting away with it before, but it exacerbated, or it's more obvious that you have to do that intentionality.
I totally agree. And you know what is very interesting with a lot of people who are conflict avoidant, including very, very senior leaders, we experience this with some of the C-levels that we work with, is there's a tendency when you are uncomfortable with what you have to say to be more vague, which is the exact opposite of what is going to work and make the situation better, because they don't want to hurt people's feelings. And that, so to really give people a way to think about, how am I structuring my conversation here in a way that's going to create connection and clarity, as opposed to say, the more vague language that may feel safer, but actually frustrates people even more.
Yeah, because it leaves room for interpretation. You're creating space for non-clarity, like the opposite of what you actually really mean to say, so they can interpret it in a way that was not your intention in the first place.
Yeah, we have some folks that we work with where we're doing coaching, and we're coaching people who are, we're coaching the boss, but we also are coaching the person who's reporting into the boss. And it's so interesting. The boss said, I told this person da 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 da. And the person on the other side said, I heard da 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 da. Right. And you're like, how is that possible? Right. But it's because of this vague language.
I told you guys before that I would love to get to some sort of examples, so folks have an idea, a tangible, concrete example. And there are so many. This is just a guidebook of so many different types of situations and conversation starters. So I just picked a few that I thought kind of resonated or were interesting to me, like being overwhelmed. That seems like everyone is overwhelmed, or handling competing priorities, matrix teams. There's 1,000 different examples in this book, but I thought it would be fun for our listeners to have an example. What do you do if you're overwhelmed? And there's a bunch of different examples of different types of overwhelm too. So maybe we can start there.
Yeah, absolutely. So, when you're talking about those 4 dimensions, connection, clarity, curiosity, and commitment, typically, as you get into some of these scenarios, you're going to draw on different elements of those. And the thing to understand for the book is that if you invest in those 4 places first, before you actually are in a conflict, it's going to be easier. You're going to have an easier time, because if we understand one another and we are truly connected and we trust one another, okay, that's going to be easier. If we have established clarity beforehand, it's going to reduce the possibility of the conflicts and the misunderstandings. But if we don't have those things, okay, now how do we get into the conversation? So let's just take, you're feeling overwhelmed. You need to say no to your boss, maybe, always a popular topic. All right. So how do we do that? Let's start with connection. I'm going to connect to the person and their intent and what's going on. So I might say, let's just take one of the harder examples of saying no to your boss about something. So, hey, listen, boss, I am deeply committed to the success of this project. I really care about our success here, and I'm all in. Okay, so I'm connecting back to them. I'm connecting to the work we're doing, to the purpose of it. Then I go to clarity. So, hey, what you're asking me to do here, this request they just brought, what you're asking me to do here would mean the following. And so I provide some clarity. It would mean that I'm going to have to divert attention from this other project, which would have these consequences. So I get very clear about what's going to happen as a result of the request. Then open the door to some curiosity. So I've been thinking, what if we did it this way? Or another approach might be this. And then I invite their perspective. What do you think? One of our GOAT's greatest of all time powerful phrases, how does this look from your perspective? So here's an alternative approach. What do you think? And then from there, once we have the discussion, get to that commitment and create that clarity. Okay, so the next step I'm hearing is, let's shift this priority here. We're going to make that deadline, move that back 2 weeks so that we can get this one done, because it's going to have these impact for us. Are we on the same page? Great. How about we schedule some time in 2 weeks on Friday? Let's review how this went. All right. So that's just how I might flow through all 4 of those dimensions on this feeling overwhelmed, needing to say no kind of example.
Yeah. And then, some additional powerful phrases for overwhelmed. One of my favorites came from a boss that I had when I was in my 20s, and I had been promoted into a pretty significant job. And she handed me a scorecard. Her name was Maureen. She handed me a scorecard. It had 27 metrics on it. And this is our first meeting. I just took this job. And she says, Karin, which of these are you going to fail at? And I said, I am not going to fail at any of these, Maureen. And she said, look, here's the thing. All of these metrics are not equally important. Mm-hmm. And if you are going to drop a ball, I want to make sure that you and I are perfectly aligned with which ball you should drop. From that, we made a powerful phrase. if I were to drop a ball here, which one should that be? I mean, the truth is sometimes even you're looking at your to-do list and everything is absolutely important. And you can only add more hours to your day and just be in a crush for so long before you're going to be burned out, resentful, and frustrated. And by the way, not do the most important things well. So to be able to have powerful phrases, which you can say things like, what is really most important here? You know, one of the things that I always did when I was in my operations roles, I would always ask my boss, what does it look like for me to completely nail this role? Like, what does success really look like? If you get to the end of this quarter and you're like, wow, Karen's team really did great. What have I accomplished? And that is a really good way to get to what really matters most. And so I was at Verizon, right? It wasn't selling accessories. It was selling a lot of volume and revenue and to our small business customers, big stuff. That way, you know which balls you can drop because you've heard from your boss what is most important.
Another aspect of being overwhelmed is asking for what you need. Sometimes somebody's not bringing something to you and piling on. Sometimes you're just drowning. And so to be able to ask for what you need and a powerful phrase to do that, I say, listen, I could use some help with this. And to break that down and again, introduce the clarity to achieve our goals. So again, I'm saying yes to the thing to achieve our goals here. Can we do this? I might need this. And whether that's shifting priorities, additional resources, training, whatever it might be, but asking for what you need and just being able to open the door to the conversation.
I use the phrase back burner for feeling like I can only ever handle maybe 3 or 4 big things at a time. And so it's my check of like, hey, I know you asked about that. That is on the back burner. It's moving along, but at a glacial pace. So we all good with that situation, or does it kind of need to the front? But I like some of these, as you said, are conversation starters for helping just to make sure that everyone is aligned and you're constantly checking in with alignment.
Yeah. So you did one of our goats right there. You did a check for understanding. So you know, like basically you said, here's where I'm putting this. Is that okay? Right? You're checking back for understanding, and it gives whoever you're saying that to an opportunity to then engage and say, yeah, that's cool. Or honestly, I got to tell you, I disagree. Right now you're having a conversation about that priority.
Okay, you mentioned GOAT. I want to also address, you have another acronym, acute conflict emergency. Okay, can you tell us what that is and how to use the book for that as well?
The way we have structured the book is the first couple chapters introduce the 4 dimensions that we've been talking about. It gives you 12 GOATs, greatest of all time, powerful phrases that work in almost any situation that you could have. So you start there. But here's the thing. You will find yourself probably in acute conflict emergency, and then your adrenaline goes up. So that is how we have structured the book, to be able to go to the table of contents and say, what is your ACE and how can we help? Yeah. So somebody just steals credit for your idea. Your boss is starting to scream F-bombs at you. You are working in a matrix environment and you have 3 bosses and they all want different things. What are the powerful phrases that you use there? And in those, we give you powerful phrases and we tell you what dimension they work with so that you can really help prepare for that conversation. So you can de-stress, calm down, take a beat, and then go handle that ACE.
Love it. And you mentioned matrix teams. So I want to jump to that because I know so many of our listeners are in these unique teams where they're very collaborative with other departments, and there may not be the project owner or the decision maker, have any purchasing power. How can they be empowered to come in and be the consultant and anything but an order taker? I would love to go through an example for some type of phrase there where you're in a matrix team, conflict emergency. What can they do?
All 4 of these dimensions factor in. And one of the best times, if you're in a matrix environment and there is the start of some kind of project activity, so many of these are useful at the beginning. And if you're in the middle of something, you might need to call a timeout and say, you know what, we have not got answers to a couple of these things. So maybe we should do that before we go any further. But if you can do it at the beginning, we're actually interviewed a variety of different expert insights, we call them, throughout the book. Different thought leaders, different senior leaders in different organizations, asking them for some of their powerful phrases. And Hugh Kimber, who's a European head general manager in a very matrixed organization, he says one of his powerful phrases is a connection powerful phrase for working in a matrix environment. How are my team's behaviors affecting other teams' ability to succeed? In other words, specifically knowing what the end result of the work that we're doing is going to have for other parts of the organization. So having that as kind of a framing question for anything that this matrix team or this department or this project is going to do is critical, and then works into some of the others. Like Karin had mentioned earlier, what does success look like? This is such a critical question. It's a clarity goat. What would a successful outcome do for you? In a matrix of situation, you're going to have a lot of different stakeholders. You might have different departments, different managers, different. Even on the end user side, on the customer side, you might have one kind of customer versus another kind of customer. And so knowing what a successful outcome is going to do for all of those folks, the more clarity you can have up front, the better you're going to be able to craft solutions. You've got your success criteria in front of you, and you know what you're aiming at before you get going. So those are a couple to get us started.
The reason I actually wanted to read a couple of these is this chapter is a little bit different than some of the other chapters. This is chapter 13. And in it, we have created some questions that if you are working in a matrix team, you can come together and actually talk through these specific questions. And we have done this with matrix teams. And at the end of the conversation, you have more clarity about how you're going to do. So David just already talked about what success looks like, who are our key stakeholders, and how will we involve and include them. And then there's other questions like, how will we facilitate information flow? Right. So how are we going to communicate? Who needs to know what? What is my role in this project? What's yours? One of our favorites is, who owns this decision?
Yes. Love
right?
it.
And then how can we make this as simple as possible? Who really needs to be in this meeting? And when we can't agree on a decision, how will we escalate? And it goes on and on. But if you can just, as a matrix team, you can just go to that chapter and you can say, which of these questions, maybe we don't need to answer them all, but which are the ones that we need to answer because of where we're getting stuck?
And for all of our ATD folks, that you're listening, and Alexandra, you mentioned this, how do you shift from the order taking perspective of things? And going back to that, what is a successful outcome going to do for you? That's the key. And having that conversation with whatever stakeholder is asked, hey, I need a 90-minute training on X. It's like, okay, what would a successful outcome to that training do for you? What is the need they're trying to satisfy? Is training even the right answer for that? Is there going to be a particular way? How are we going to evaluate success? All of those questions that can often frustrate that person who I just want my 90-minute training. I'm trying to help you be successful. I want to make sure that we are meeting the actual needs. So having that kind of a conversation up front, knowing it can be hard, knowing it takes that extra moment, particularly if you've got somebody who's a little aggressive or urgent in their communication style, you're still serving them and you're serving the people that they're serving and your learners as well. So having taking the time to answer these questions that Karin just went through will make such a difference for the success of your programs and ultimately your career as well.
I got so excited looking at that chapter and looking at some of those examples, just knowing myself. I've worked on small teams, small projects where something's new, it's an experiment. So roles aren't defined and we're kind of moving fast and furious and then getting frustrated and things are slowing down. And you're like, oh, wait, it's because we just haven't had this conversation explicitly. I'm assuming something, you're assuming something. We need to get together and talk this out. So those are the things that I learned in hindsight. But for anyone who is about to start into a new project, or as you said, maybe you're in an emergency or crisis moment, I just absolutely loved some of those examples, knowing that personally, that's helped me get back on track or realize that was the disconnect, is just hadn't had the communication with someone I was working with. So we don't know who owns that task in the project. I told you all, I was surprised to see there was a big section about bosses. And it made me have this aha moment of, oh, is that just the most common challenge ever? I guess that people have difficult bosses. So I know you guys have thoughts and why there's so much devotion to this in your book?
First, let me say, a couple of years ago, right when I was starting Let's Grow, I guess it's more than a decade ago, but when I was starting Let's Grow Leaders, I was also supplementing my income with teaching an MBA program at a major university. And I was teaching evening classes, and I had an elective, and it was called Dealing with Difficult People. And your project was you had to bring a difficult person, and that was going to be, you were going to work on this situation with this difficult person all semester long. Can you guess who everybody brought? Like, everybody brought their boss. So like, this isn't new, this situation. And then the data, we had so many examples in the World Workplace Conflict and Collaboration Survey of people saying it was their boss that they were having conflict with. In that whole section, we go through all the common things that we heard in the research. My boss is a micromanager. My boss stole credit for my work. My boss is screaming all the time. And what do you do?
The most major conflict I've had in my career, 85% of the 5,000 plus people across the world said it was their boss, their manager. Wow. The other 15, it was a coworker, right? Those are our only choices.
Yeah.
So there were a couple of folks, it was a direct report, but in most cases, right? And why? Of course, the why is there's power dynamics involved, all of that kind of thing. And so that can cause us to gosh, what can I say? Can I do? Our encouragement for everyone is you can absolutely have a really effective, healthy conversation with your manager. I want to, as we set the stage for this, go back early in my career, like 18 months in, I had a CEO who put together this marketing project and I hated it. I thought it lacked integrity. I was like, this is not right. But I didn't say anything because, CEO, and all these stories I was telling myself about, gosh, if I say anything, I'm going to get fired, all this kind of thing. And I didn't sleep for 3 nights, just in anxiety about this. And finally, I didn't use any powerful phrases. I just popped my cork and was like, I can't take this. I don't want to do this. This lacks integrity. I don't like this. What do you think he said next? I was certainly ready for, there's the door. But what he actually said was, David, I don't see it that way. No, I don't think it lacks integrity, but I don't want you to violate your conscience either. And then he asked me the question that I really should have asked myself from the beginning, which was, what do you think we can do to make this work for you? And it was such a powerful moment, a great learning opportunity for me that he asked me that question. And there was an easy answer. I said, hey, what if we did this? Boom. 5 seconds later, he's like, yeah, we can do that. Let's do it. And it solved the problem. But the reason that I hadn't got there is I was telling myself all these stories in my head about how awful this person was because they weren't seeing the world my way. Well, I had never given him a chance to see the world my way. And so in those moments, even with our manager, who can feel like one of the most difficult conversations, if we stay silent in those, we're depriving the other person of a chance to react differently. We're depriving ourselves of the chance to learn and grow. And so, yes, we need to do it elegantly, need to do it respectfully in a way that's not just going to get us shown the door. And there's no need for that. There are good ways to do it. That's what these powerful phrases are all about.
It's funny. I just have such a great manager right now that I forget that I've also been in situations where I've had some conflict, and it was very hard to have healthy conflict. And I wonder if I would have been more empowered if I had this book earlier in my career during some of those instances. I have a question as we're sort of shifting towards the end of this conversation. If you have unique advice for L&D professionals specifically who may be trying to figure out how they can disseminate this type of work into their organizations, so not just relevant to them personally in the work that they're doing, but they want to empower, whether it's a senior leader or whether it's any individual in their organization, you're an individual contributor and you're new, but this would be helpful for you to just have less stress and be able to manage your priorities and feel like you can have a great relationship with your boss. Any ideas for what an L&D professional can do to, I don't know, like a massive big book club seems ambitious, but maybe there's other options.
Thank you so much for asking that, because we really thought about that while we were writing the book. This book is definitely written so that an individual, you can go pick it up and it will help you as a person, right? But if teams read it together and are talking about it, that's where you really are going to have this opportunity to make lasting change. We thought about how do we create some resources, and we also, because we do so much work with HR ATD, how do you help the trainers too? So we have put together this collaborative conversations guide, and it's pretty thick where it's got a couple of different elements to it. And you can find this in our Conflict and Collaboration Resource Center. And we'll put the link in the show notes, but also throughout the book, we put the QR code in there like 8 times to how to get to that.
If you want to find it right now, you can go to conflictphrases.com and that will get you there.
Conflictphrases.com. We have a book group discussion guide that breaks it down and things to talk about as your team as you're reading the book. But we also have what are your GOAT's greatest of all time powerful phrases, like a trainer exercise with cute little GOAT templates where you can give them out to a team of people. You can talk about our GOATs, but then have everybody make their own GOAT, which is interesting. One of the things that we did we ran a senior L&D network guided networking session at ATD in addition to our main session. And so we had a lot of very senior L&D leaders in there. And we talked about conflict cocktails. Like, what are the complex dynamics that are happening in your organization? Well, that exercise that we facilitated there, we've also put out step by step in this guide of how can you have a conversation, maybe with an executive team, about what the conflict cocktails that are happening. So lots of tools and templates there for people to read the book together and to apply it. We also put in there role plays. So, because it's easier as a team to talk about conflicts that you're having that are maybe pretend, even if you're really having them, right? And so then you can say, oh, well, how would we handle a conflict like this? And so we've made it really easy for people just to pull those straight out and use them. And then the other thing that we have is a guide, which I'll let David talk about, is our synergy stack, which is really a way to talk about habits for each one of these 4 dimensions.
The Synergy Stack is a team collaboration guide, self-working with just a little bit of facilitation juice. But you take each of these 4 dimensions. It's a card deck, which has 55 cards in it, all 4 dimensions, 12 habits per card with a sample phrase that you might use in expression of that habit. And people can identify their own. They can speak on behalf of their team. Here's the ones we need. Really powerful way for teams to self-diagnose. So as a learning and development professional, makes you look like a rock star. The team is figuring out and owning those conflict habits, productive collaboration habits for themselves. And that's the Synergy Stack. You can find that at synergy-stack.com. That's another resource.
Awesome. Lots and lots of resources. I love the term conflict cocktail too. Keep telling you guys, you just make this seem really fun and approachable and less, scary. You've helped me change my mindset. And so I'm sure folks listening are feeling a little bit better about conflict and tackling it, making it productive, maybe embracing it, which is the goal of this conversation. So thank you so much. I want to shift back to focusing on you guys specifically. Do you have any current learning goals? Any ways you're getting out of your comfort zone?
Yeah,
Yes,
yes, all the time. As entrepreneurs, if you're not doing that, you're probably not running a successful business. But for me specifically, I handle a lot of the operations in our organization. So that aforementioned card deck product, one of the things that I'm constantly learning right now is international distribution. So when you're talking about warehousing and shipping and customs and duties and all of those good things, there are ways to do it. There are ways not to do it. So it's been a fun learning journey for me recently as we've been having a great clamoring for the tool to get into everybody's hands. So making sure that we know how to get it to them as quickly as possible.
For me, I've been spending a good bit of time in Southeast Asia recently. Keynoted and was involved with a bunch of CHROs in the HR Malaysia Forum, and I'm preparing to go back this fall. And that's a different dynamic. We're talking about the same things. Humans are humans, and all 4 of these dimensions play out in other cultures as well. And it's not exactly the same. Mm-hmm. And so how do I show up as a credible thought leader and helpful person to get people to have the confidence and competence to do this well and be sensitive to the cultural dynamics that I did not grow up in? And so growing up as a woman in Malaysia is different than growing up as a woman outside of Washington, D.C. And so I'm learning, I'm collaborating, I'm building deep relationships with some of our strategic partners over there to be as open and curious about what might I not know about this so that we can be the most helpful as we can be.
Thank you both for sharing your very specific learning goals. I'm always inspired when folks feel willing to share exactly what they're working on. That sounds awesome. How can listeners keep up with you all in your activity? You've already mentioned a bunch of resources, but is there anything else besides? We'll include these all in the show notes.
Yeah, our website is letsgrowleaders.com. And we're talking about something very specific that we're working on. This is our latest project, but, we are really known for practical tools and techniques for human-centered leaders. We engage with organizations in long-term culture change. We help emerging leaders. We work with executive teams. So if you are curious about what we do, we'd love to connect with you. We have a blog. We write every week. We do a blog post. David does a Leadership Without Losing Your Soul podcast, and I do an Asking for a Friend video on LinkedIn. So, and if you subscribe to our newsletter every week, you'll get all three of those things.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Karin and David. It was such a pleasure to talk to you both and such a treat.
Thank you so much. It's been a real joy to meet you and talk with you about this important topic.
Alexandria, thank you.
Thank you to our sponsor, Overdrive.
Thanks for listening to this podcast from the Association for Talent Development. Be sure to check the show notes for resources mentioned in today's episode. And if you found the show useful or insightful, please be sure to like, subscribe, and share it with a colleague.